This is the Volleyball Coaching Wizards Podcast, covering everything coaching, motivated and inspired by interviews and conversations with some of the world's great volleyball coaches. To learn more about the project, visit volleyballcoachingwizards.com. Now here are your hosts, John Foreman and Mark Lebedew.
Welcome to episode 15 of the podcast. Former NCAA Division III coach Joel Deering is back with us once more. Last time in episode 12, we shared his thoughts on coaching to the performance as opposed to coaching to the match score. This time, we're going to focus our attention on another snippet from his interview, in which he talks about the need to give attention to the top players on your team's roster. As coaches, there's a tendency for us to perhaps focus at the middle, or maybe to spend more time working with the less experienced, less skilled players in an effort to try to bring them up to the level of everybody else on the team, which obviously, leaves us not giving as much attention to the players at the top end of the roster. So the conversation in this episode focuses on the things that we can do to kind of correct that and how we can keep working our best players and keep developing them over time. So hopefully you enjoy.
I don't think when I first coached, I don't know that I was as focused on strengthening our best players. I really do think there are a lot of blind spots for coaches, and I think my situation might have been closer to, a high school than, a scholarship situation. I had to look at my team, and we're trying to improve everybody. And sometimes in that process, your best players, how are you challenging your very best player? If your best player is your best athlete, if your best player is clearly better than anybody else on your team, how are you getting them better on a daily basis? And so that's something that I really worked at. I wanted everyone to get better, including our strongest players. And I think sometimes we don't think that way.
First off, before we even get into the subject of coaching your best player, I found it really interesting that Joel made his comment about coaching blind spots. And I'm hoping that anybody who either listens to this or listens to Joel's full interview actually realizes the implications there and starts to have some thoughts about what their own coaching blind spots are, because we certainly all have them. But getting to the main point, there's kind of this notion that in any kind of educational setting, the tendency of the teacher or the coach in our case is to kind of work toward the mean. You coach the bulk of the players who are in the middle, or in what probably happens a little bit more in a team context is maybe you think you need to bolster the lower end of the roster to bring them up to competitiveness with everybody else. And in either case, the people at the top end of the roster tend to get left out.
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting parts of that conversation. Typically, I'm sure that most coaches think that the best players are the most difficult to push, I guess is one thing. And so it's easier to spend time with the guys or the players that are easiest to improve. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, where you can get bigger gains in a shorter period of time, or bigger gains for the same amount of work. I thought that Joel's comment about pushing players in training, particularly, I think, or the ones that are better than the rest. That's also a really interesting one, because when you set up competition in practice, a lot of times you play first six against second six, which is a problem in and of itself, or potentially a problem in and of itself. But if you have one guy that's better, it's really difficult to find ways to push him organically in practice.
Agreed. I was just dealing with that coaching in Sweden, where my top outside hitter was miles above say, my top opposite or the other outside hitter or most of the other attackers and blockers in the team, such that, we had a really hard time challenging her from an offense-defense perspective. The things that I had to do to put her in situations where she was going to have to work to develop her game was to try to match her up with, our setter, who was actually a slightly better blocker than our opposite, and to put her up against our better middle blocker when she was attacking, or to have her blocking against our best middle blocker running the slide or some sort of set behind or whatever. And, creating those circumstances that could benefit as many players as possible, and not just that one player, obviously, but, you do have to find ways of trying to push that one as far as you possibly can, given the restraints that you might have.
Yeah, I was going to go for the matchup idea as well, because the obviously if you do first six against second six, which I'm not at all in favor of, then it's impossible to do that. But to have hitters, a better spiker spiking always against the best block is the most obvious one, or one that I've seen in a professional team is that whatever the drill is, we talk sometimes about confirmation points, so that you have a particular goal for the drill that you have to reach. If it's 2 out of 4 or 5 out of 7 or 3 in a row, or a side out plus a high ball, or whatever it is, that if you reach that, then you have a confirmation point. Sometimes it can be a break point, or sometimes you could need to get one side out or something to keep the point that you win. And one version of that I've seen is where the best player had to score a point. So whatever the drill was, it had to finish with, I guess, the maximum pressure that was possible, which is the best player to score a point, a single point on a good situation, or whatever the situation may be.
So kind of like a secondary wash.
Yes. I guess you could call it that. We call them confirmation points. I think that comes from the US men's terminology. I'm not really sure, but I've actually heard them. Vital calls them golden points, actually, okay. but something like that.
Right. All right. Well, that's an interesting way to go. And obviously, you can also, if you're doing any sort of individual objectives, you can set their targets to be slightly more aggressive or slightly more consistent, or whatever is appropriate for the position and the situation and the player. As you say, instead of hitting 3 kills out of 10, they have to hit 4 kills out of 10, on out of system or something along those lines.
I would go even further and say that you can add a specific technical goal, so that the player can only score by spiking cross court, or can only score by tooling, or some added requirement.
Right, something that obviously you'd want them to be working on.
Yes, because the best player can normally get by playing the easiest shot, by hitting it softly in the seam, or which is one I've had in one of my teams, who always took the easiest shot, and he won most of the time, or enough of the time to keep him happy.
Right. Yeah, with my player at Svedala, she could go up, and if she got max approach, she could practically pick the spot where she wanted to hit the ball.
Yep.
It wasn't really much of a challenge to her. The one downside to some of the matchups that you might try to do is sometimes that means you're not working on the combinations that you'd necessarily like to work on. So, for example, I mentioned putting my setter against my outside hitter because the setter was slightly better blocker. But that also means that my setter isn't working with that hitter as much as maybe we would like to do under another circumstance.
In all of these the most basic level, the have the best team performance, or rather maybe the most cohesive team performance, is to spend the most period of time with 6 players. And everything that you do that's away from that involves some trade-off, because you don't really want to do that all the time, because you need to keep the other people, the other players involved. You need to push the first team or the better players in some way, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are trade-offs in everything you do, and you have to be prepared to accept them.
Right. And just in general terms, one of the things, because I had this issue at Exeter where we're training essentially 2 squads as one, first team and a second team, from a competitive perspective. So, we train all together and do split squads for competition. And some of the players on the second team were clearly, they were never going to be first team players. They were just too inexperienced, or just didn't have the physical tools or whatever. But we're all in the gym at the same time. We're all in one court, constrained space. So you have to come up with ways of making that happen. And some of what I did was just to get them into drills or games where either I assigned, okay, we're playing 3v3 over here, and it's the 6 best players, and we're playing 3v3 over there, and it's the other 6 players, or something where the players kind of end up naturally filtering out, like some sort of winners competition or whatever that kind of works in that direction. So eventually you do get to the point where it's the best players playing the best players and the weaker players going against the weaker ones.
Yeah, at different times I took the opposite approach to that, and so most of the time I want to have even teams in practice, or close to even teams, so that it's competitive. But even in some drill situations that weren't competitive, at different times I've had the best players, I've matched the best and the weakest together. And the reasoning being that the best player working with the best player can cover the weakest player. So they have to pay more attention. And the weakest player gets more contacts because he or she is with the best player. So everybody ends up having about the same number of meaningful contacts, more than if they were matched by skill level, particularly if the weakest ones are all together and you keep them apart. From the rest, they end up practicing less than everybody else.
Yeah, fair point. And actually, your comment about matching them up got me thinking about another way that we can encourage the development of the more experienced and the better players is by turning them into coaches. Not officially on the roster, on the bench or anything like that, but putting them into situations where they have to actually work with the other players and help them and bring them along.
Yep.
But I know from my own perspective, I became a much better player, and this is all relative, of course, when I started coaching and thinking in terms of the game from a coaching perspective.
Yeah.
And I've seen that with many other players along the years. So it's something that I've always encouraged in general terms. But this is kind of one of those situations where it could really pay off in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that just from a general point of view, to have players actively involved with coaching each other is a valuable tool in and of itself.
Now, we kind of talked about in the beginning, and I think you alluded to this a little bit, but we didn't really go down the path, was the idea of, as coaches, we maybe tend to prioritize our time where we think we're going to get the most impact. And that brings to mind the idea of do you work on strengthening your weakest parts, or do you work on getting even better at your strongest parts? And I know there's competing philosophies on that.
That's a really good question, I think there are two approaches to it, and maybe at the professional level at least, and one is the obvious one, that you spend all the time with the best players and the starters because they're the ones that really count in the end. And that's one way of being successful. The one that I mentioned at the beginning, which is just spending the most time with the ones that the coach thinks are the easiest to improve, I think is another one. Vital Heinen has talked not in the interview with us, but he's talked about coaching individuals and not the team. So his goal being to reach every single person in the team, and by improving each individual, then the team will improve.
Yeah, there's definitely that side of things.
Yeah, so it's one of those things. There's no yes and no, right and wrong. It comes down to the coach's philosophy and I guess the level that they're coaching at also makes a difference.
Well, yeah, and kind of to that point, what your expectations are and your outcomes is obviously, if you're in a developmental situation, you're going to have one approach. But if you're in a competitive situation where it's all about how we do this season, then perhaps you're going to take a different approach.
That's the same. That's the same with everything. I really think though that the coaches, that more coaches just take an easy way out and just coach the ones that are the easiest. But there's one side of it that Joel didn't specifically mention, but that arises often, that you hear often about, is the team dynamics of how you coach the different, and what effect it has on the group by focusing on whichever level of player that is.
Right. Yeah, you can't ever exclude the impact of extra attention in one area or less attention in another area, because and maybe this doesn't impact certain teams the way it does other teams, but I've definitely seen cases where you're spending more time with so and so. You're like, ugh.
Well, I'm actually thinking about it from a different point of view, that and you hear stories like this of, for example, from professional level, you talk about a guy like Popovich or like Jackson, and they spent the most time pushing the best players. So I just heard recently, the last couple of weeks, about Jackson coaching Pippen and Jordan, for example, and in the video sessions, he would be on them the most, more than anybody else. And the idea, of course, is that if you show that you're pushing the best players, or that's the level that the best players are required of, then it automatically engages the rest of the people and brings them up to that level.
Okay, or at least get some thinking of that's the level they need to be at.
Well, the level of commitment, obviously, not the level of performance. You can't, or the level of attention, or the level of engagement.
Yep.
So you can't ask somebody to be as good a player as Jordan, but you can ask him to work as hard.
Right.
And if you push Jordan to work hard, it's much easier to say something to anybody else. You just have to say, look at Michael.
Yeah.
And that happens automatically.
Yeah, and the other perhaps benefit to being harder or tougher on the better players is that it avoids the circumstance where the starters or the stars are seen to be coaches' favorites.
Yes, right there.
Yeah, because I know I've had a coach that I've worked with before told, well, you like your starters better, and it was couched in a it's not really a problem manner by the player who was saying this, who was not one of the starters. She's like, it was kind of like, I completely understand, but we think that you like the starters better, which you don't want to hear
that. I don't like hearing that because I don't like the word "like" in that situation. Yeah. Because it implies that who's starting or otherwise is a function of some personal preference.
Right.
And yeah, you kind of hear this a lot, and I've heard it before. I've had players say to me, "Why don't you like me?" I said, "What do you mean, why don't I like you? I like you perfectly fine." He said, "Well, why aren't I playing then?" And I said, "Well, that has nothing to do with like. That's to do with performance. I can like somebody who doesn't perform, and I can not like somebody who does perform. The two things are not related to each other."
Right. Yeah. You always hear, you don't always, but coach hates me because they didn't put you in. You're not a starter. You don't play the role that you want to play or whatever. Right. The player personalizes it when it's not actually anything personal.
Yes.
Or at least hopefully it isn't.
But yeah, I see the other side, this of treating different parts of the group differently. What you see a lot, and I have seen a lot, is the coaches who pick on the weaker players, and they're always screaming at them and picking out all their mistakes, and I always thought that was counterproductive for a whole bunch of reasons.
I mean, it's demoralizing for that player, and then the rest of them are just waiting for it to happen to them.
Or not, because the one who who spends the time screaming at the weakest player is never talking to the best player. And
I was thinking more of the middle players.
The middle players might get it every now and again, but you see it often, you hear about it often as it's just the worst player gets screamed at all the time, and in that case, I'm 100% convinced that it's the coach who's afraid to say it to the other guys, or who's taking out frustrations on the young guy, or is even trying to say to somebody else, trying to make a point to somebody else, but is taking the easy way out, and that's why I use the phrase, taking the easy way out. To describe that situation.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're butting up against our time here. So, any final thoughts?
I think how you deal with the different levels inside the group is is one of those questions that you have to address at some point or another. And ideally, you want to spend the same amount of time with everybody, but that's not always possible, and you have to find the best way to get the most or as much as you can out of everybody. And Phil Jackson's idea of pushing the best players the hardest seems to make some sense to me.
Right.
Even if I might not myself do it all the time.
Well, and I would take it a step further and say, it's not necessarily about quantity, just kind of like touches. It's not necessarily about quantity, but it's about quality. So you may not spend as much time with each player, but you want to spend equally important time, equally meaningful time with each player.
Yes. Quality versus quantity. I like that.
Exactly.
That sounds something like there's always a way we can practice less.
It kind of does sound like that, doesn't it?
It does.
And that's for those who aren't paying attention at home, that's from the Jan de Brunt interview.
Yes.
All right, we'll wrap it up there.
It all comes back to the same things in the end.
Of course.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. For show notes and more, visit volleyballcoachingwizards.com/podcast. Got an idea for a future episode or want to ask a question? Send an email to podcast@volleyballcoachingwizards.com.